Welcome back from Labor Day holiday. Nice to see all of you out there probably paying homage to the laboring people of the United States by buying goods that they manufactured or at least helped to import, or wherever commerce goes on these days. As we get into the second chapter, and that's why I want to spend most of the time talking about today, I need to do a little bit of housekeeping. It also gives us an opportunity to talk about the review sheet. As I was looking over the review sheet since we last met, I noticed that there are 3 terms on the review sheet that we've not talked about in lecture. Now, one of the themes that we need to talk about is, what does the review sheet mean to you? And for those of you that are likely to lose your review sheet, maybe you've lost it 5 or 6 or 7, 8, 9 times already. It's on WebCT. Yes, you have to push your button. Now, I have extra copies, but not with me right here. They're over there. We'll get them later on. The review sheet, as I hand it out and deal with it, is a guideline, not a contract. Should I have you all say in unison, it is a guideline, not a contract? A lot of times students will say, well, I studied everything on the review sheet, but you asked things that were not on the review sheet. Wow. Is that a revelation? As she said, you don't say, right? So look at these terms. These are the kinds of terms that I put on the review sheet just to say these are the sorts of terms, but we've covered so many more terms even in the first chapter than we could ever have on a review sheet. And if I put everything on the review sheet, you know, pretty soon we're talking about something that's 20 pages long. So think of it as a guideline. But nevertheless, as I was looking at it, I saw 3 words that are on there, and they're so relevant to where we're going, because that first chapter and the first couple of days is so full of jargon, of social science, that I wanted to go back and make sure that we sort of focused on what was a good definition for all 3 of these terms. The first one is hypothesis, and if you look, for instance, on page 11, you will see the word hypothesis defined there. There are a couple of key elements to what we put into the definition of a hypothesis. First of all, it is a conjectural statement, meaning that it's something that we can speculate about. We don't know for sure, but we believe that we know something about the relationship between 2 or more variables. And you remember when we talked about variables on Thursday of last week? So a hypothesis says these 2 variables, or these multiple variables, work together in a particular way. And for instance, we might say watching a lot of television that's violent increases the likelihood that people will think the world is violent. We've got 2 major variables in there. One is the amount and kind of television that people watch, and secondly, then their sense of what the world is like. Conjectural statement about the relationship between 2 or more variables. The second part of our definition that's important is that it has to be empirically testable. We have to be able to test a hypothesis by seeing whether or not those variables do interact the way in which we speculated that they might. And that's the whole business of social science research, and you expand more upon that in other classes, either in the School of Communication or around campus. Relevant also to that kind of discussion, as well as the review sheet, you'll find on page 18 2 words. One is reliability and one is validity. Validity refers to the extent to which we actually are measuring what we think we're measuring. One of the problems that we get into in social science is that often that which we're measuring is relatively ambiguous and or relatively subjective. It's not like heat. We talked about heat the other day, which at the level that we would be discussing it, add heat to the bottom of a pan, increase molecular action, and we get steam or we get boiling water. If we talk about what is an attitude, or we talk about what are media effects, or we're talking about what is trust or what is intimacy, those are much more subjective, aren't they? But the first question of a good variable is, to what extent are we measuring, actually, truly measuring what we think we're measuring? And that's the question of validity. The second term that we identify on that page, page 18, is reliability. Now, reliability is a way of determining validity. If we go out and measure the same stuff over and over and over again, then we probably have a valid variable because it works reliably. Well, let's imagine that you have a yardstick that is made out of rubber or elastic, and every time you go out to measure it, it measures something that is slightly longer or slightly shorter. It wouldn't be a reliable measure, would it? It wouldn't be a reliable measure because you get different results trying to measure the same thing repeatedly, so it wouldn't be reliable. Well, I thought it was worth going back over those terms, re-emphasizing them, spending a little bit of time talking about the review sheet, because the review sheet is important to you, but as you all know now, what? A review sheet is a guide, not a contract, not a promise, but does suggest the sorts of terms that we are likely to pull out and put on the examinations. And we'll talk more about getting ready for the examination as we get closer to it. Some of you are still trying to make sure you know where your classes are and figure out how you move between them and get the books and all of that. So we'll postpone talking about the exams until we get a little bit closer. So here we are, Chapter 2. Chapter 2 gives us an opportunity to talk about what is communication. What is communication? I think you have to sort of put yourself back into an historical frame of mind. Imagine that you go into a town where you've never been before. Maybe it's a town in the United States. Maybe it is a town in some other country around the world. One of the things you begin to notice is that there is something there that you can observe. So you see something going on, but you don't always know what the various patterns are. I remember very vividly the first time I was ever in England. And the first time I was in England, I also, while still suffering jet lag, started learning to drive a rental car on what I thought was the wrong side of the road. So now we have to figure all of this out. So here we are, we're on the wrong side of the road. And one of the tricks that the rental car people always like to play on you is that Americans tend to want to go to the left side of the car to get ready for their rental car, and then the person who is renting you the car likes to say, "Are you the rider or are you the driver?" Right. Then you look and you think, well, I'm pretty stupid. I've been doing this for a long time, but now I don't know what I'm doing. Everything is on the wrong side. You have to learn to shift with your left hand if it's a standard transmission instead of your right hand, and everything is backwards. And I was born and raised in Colorado, and when you come to the top of the hill in Colorado, you tend to move over to the right because people coming over the hill might be on your lane. Well, in England, you don't want to do that. You might find yourself going just the wrong direction. Then we went into a roundabout. Oh, that was fun. That means that you can go in and go round and round and round in a circle until you decide where to get out. It's a matter of sheer luck that my wife and I and daughter are not still in that roundabout, because everybody else in there knows what they're doing. And here I am. Well, see, that's that notion of communication. If we turn the clock back, one of the questions that we ask ourselves is not only what is communication, but what have people thought communication was over time? How did their thinking change? Particularly given the fact that all of a sudden people went from having very little, if no, interest in what is communication to having so much interest that we then eventually developed an academic discipline in the 20th century called the communication discipline. Communication departments, communication majors. You go back in history and they aren't there. We didn't study communication. Now we have, for a long time, we have a very robust discipline. We have lots of journals. We have lots of scholars. We have lots of students. And so the question is, how do we go about this business of studying the nature of communication? Now, in just a minute, I'm going to ask you to tell me what you think communication is all about. But before I go down that road, what I want to do is to emphasize that as an example on page 46 and 47, we have a section called Communication, a Hard Term to Define. I will never, ever, 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 ever ask you to identify communication on an examination, because arguably you could put down almost anything and I would have to accept it as the right definition because there are so many definitions out there. So rather than just learning one definition, let's think about this stuff called the communication phenomena. What are we really talking about? What are we investigating? As we think about going into this unfamiliar town, what do we focus on that really gives us a sense of the nature of the people in that town? What goes on? What happens? What is its essence, if you would? What is its relationship? There's a chair way back there in the corner. You may not be able to see it. All right? Now, one of the starting points, if I were to ask you what is communication, is that I'm guessing that somebody somewhere told you that it has something to do with transmission, right? Transmission? So what do you think? What's communication? Transmission? Is communication transmission? What's a good definition of communication? No thoughts whatsoever? Yeah.
I just wrote here, this is a very broad definition.
I think it's best, by the way, okay?
The entire scale of human interaction and information sharing, from nonverbal interpersonal communication to global mass media.
What do you think? You're nodding your head. You like that?
Sounds good.
Push the buttons.
Sounds good.
Okay. Okay. We're teaching you how to push the button, and then, yes.
Anything that sends a signal to a receiver?
What's a signal?
Information?
Is a signal information, or does a signal contain information?
Information is translated upon reception.
The information is translated upon reception. So if I'm driving along, one of the typical symbols that I might see is a sign of a particular shape and color. Some of you remember from when you were 16, you had to memorize all of that stuff so you could pass your driver's license. And sometimes they would give you the signal in just a silhouette. It could be a triangle. A triangle is a warning sign. See, some of you passed. Others of you didn't. If it has 8 sides, it's a stop sign, right? Now, the state of Texas or the city of Houston or whoever it is puts those up to signal to you what they would like for you to do, right? Do you do it? Not always, she says, but she forgot to push her button, so she didn't make her debut on television, or did she? Sometimes we say, well, I'll kind of stop. You ever do a kind of stop? Yeah. Come on, everybody know, that's right, a kind of stop. And out on the highway it says, what, 55, 65, 75? Going home, out in the country, up to 90 the other day. 80 wasn't fast enough. You wanted to play in the left lane, you had to get out of it unless you were going 80. But the sign said 65. But it signals to us the information, which is, what is the state's preference in this regard?
Isn't it an interaction of written and verbal messages?
Interaction of written and verbal. What about pictures? Oh, throw in pictures too. Okay, what if I'm going to represent a product? Let's talk about 3 different kinds of chocolate. Milk chocolate, etc., etc. Can I have chocolate and taste as a means of communication?
Yes, if you see the picture in the advertisement.
Sam's gives you taste all day long on Saturdays, right? Some of us men just go down there to wander around and eat, etc., etc. So they want you to taste it, a taste test. You go into your local store, you may be able to use colognes, perfumes, to get a sense of its odor, its fragrance, right? So, in a sense, anything that can be meaningful is the basis of nonverbal communication or communication in general, is that right? Posture, stance, eye contact, is all of that meaningful? Now you used the word signal. Is there a difference between a symbol and a signal? There is. Push your button. Tell me what the difference is.
A signal, like, might be, is referred to a stop sign. It might be the word stop, but then
Okay.
a symbol might be the stop sign itself.
Okay.
The red octagon type thing.
Okay. We're going to talk more in the next chapter on language about symbols. Symbols are conventionalized, aren't they? They're conventionalized. We agree that certain sounds and certain squiggles have certain meanings. One of the things that we just, in this country, we have so much trouble with international things like a war in Iraq, because all of a sudden people are speaking something we don't understand. What's wrong with those people? Why don't they speak English so we can understand them? Well, they have a different symbol system, don't we? And I would say that symbols are different than just signals, so we could have signals and symbols. Somebody had a hand up and back. No? 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 Okay. Now, nobody liked the notion of transmission so far. Really? Nobody in any of your classes ever talked about transmission, or maybe now you're so afraid of the word transmission, knowing that I bang on that. One of the reasons I bang on it is, and we'll talk about it a little bit later, how it came about. It was a very early model. It was a very early theory, if we want, of how communication operates. There was a reason for that. We'll get into it. There's a model later on in today's discussion that we can look at. The folks at the telephone company, Shannon and Weaver, working for Bell Labs, came up with the notion of transmission. And transmission can be a signal, if you look at it in the sort of the same sense that he was using it. If you are listening to sound on a telephone or on a radio, that's a signal which you then, at least at the basic level of hearing the differentiation of the sound, used to make sense of what's going on. The same thing would be true of a musical instrument. The musical instrument makes different sounds, and we then use that as a signal which we translate on into something else. So, signals can be transmitted. But can ideas be transmitted, or do ideas come about some other way? I don't know how many of you are familiar with the psychological explanation of the world around us being processes of stimulus and response. Is that fairly common? Yes. Stimulus and response. Can you tell us a little bit? And you have to push your button. Yeah.
Like the whole time? I have to
I
press
think
it?
so,
Okay.
yeah.
It doesn't just stay down. Well, energy is transmitted in your
Okay.
body, like through touch, sight, sound, and
All of the senses.
all the senses, and it's transmitted to your brain, which then interprets it.
All right.
So that's, and it kind of, which interprets it into your world, sort of
Okay.
thing.
So if I say the word dog, each of you might think of something about dog, right? What comes to mind when I say dog? Barking. Your dog. I have no idea what you're talking about. If I say my dog, you have no idea, do I? Did I transmit an idea to your mind, or did I elicit? E-L-I-C-I-T, right? It's not I-L, it's E-L. There's a difference between those two. A word sparks, produces a response, and is the response the meaning? That's sort of what you were suggesting a while ago, right? The signal occurs, and then we interpret it, and is the interpretation where the meaning is? Is the interpretation where the meaning is? Is that what meaning is? Yes, push your button.
Okay. What if I say dog? What comes?
That you are using a colloquial that could either be used in jest or it could be used in ridicule. Duh. Now, you could say it differently, and I might interpret it differently. If you say, duh, then I think that's what I'm saying when somebody tries to explain a computer to me. Duh. I'm not very bright. I don't understand it, right? But a lot of times if I say duh, I could be ridiculing somebody. Isn't that a part of your jargon? Isn't that, you know, yeah, duh. It's like our whole vocabulary changes in some sense every generation. What do you think? What do you think when you say duh or somebody says duh?
I think you probably don't have an idea, or whoever says duh doesn't have an idea of whatever the other person is saying, cannot decode what that person is saying.
Ah, you brought in another word, decoding. Is that the same as interpreting? Being a respondent? Decoding, responding?
Yes.
Yes. Okay, yeah.
I think defining communication and effective communication are probably two separate discussions.
Probably so. And one can argue that we have to begin to know what the phenomena is that we're talking about. And then the next question is, how can we communicate more accurately? How can we communicate more persuasively? How can we communicate more? And we can then put a lot of evaluative terms on it, can't we? We became fascinated early in the discussion of communication as to knowing whether communication can break down. There was a sort of mechanistic approach that it was like a car that you're driving communication along and all of a sudden the wheel comes off or it runs out of gasoline. And then we thought it can be repaired. Can we repair communication? It's difficult, isn't it? Once I've said something that hurts your feelings, I can't just say, forget that, take that, you know, da-da-da-da-da-da. That's still there, isn't it? So we keep going. One of the themes that we talk about in terms of communication process is that it just keeps going on and on and on, and we can't go back and say, just forget about all of this. Now, I guess that Will Smith and Tommy Lee Jones can make you forget about various sorts of things, but other than that, we're pretty well stuck with what it is that we said. Now, one of the things we find interesting in that regard, we talk about conversation or relational history or memory. Do women and men remember conversational, relational conversation or interaction in the same way? No. Do women tend to focus on different things than men? Yes. Do women, in my mind, never forget? And men never remember? Is that the standard of the world around us? See? So even that becomes a problem when we think about, here we are communicating again. Now, my wife and I are just about, or fixing, as you say in Texas, just about to have our 38th wedding anniversary. And to this day, she will not tell me what I told her in some moment of romantic bliss was our song. Because I don't remember. And she does. And to this day, she says, if you don't remember, then I'm not going to tell you. You thought you were being romantic. You were just being stupid. Duh. All right? So, there we are, all of this. And it's interesting, isn't it, that within our own relationships, our own family and whatever else it might be, we are often developing our own symbol system, aren't we? We're developing our own signal system. And when we talk about signals, some of you may have watched football games over the weekend. Football is full of signals, isn't it? Whistle blowing, motions, and all of that kind of stuff, and we have to learn what that means. And I would say that the movement of a referee or an umpire or a field judge or whatever those people are, it got to be too complicated for me. Some of you, too, you just call them zebras, right? People out there with the red and white. That's football, but not umpires, right? Field judges and so forth. The notion is that they're in their black and white jerseys, and you know they're out there signaling, and then you get to interpret, were they right or were they wrong? You and John Madsen. Right. Anyway, so we talk about that dimension. He used the word interaction in his definition. Interaction. One of the things that people added on to as they got more and more into communication is they became more sensitive to the realm or to the dimension that was added by interaction. Because the first communication model tended to think about the information or whatever it was being sort of transmitted from point A to point B, but there was no sense of interaction. People have argued that the recognition of interaction has been one of the most important breakthroughs in the nature of communication theory. For instance, can you discuss interpersonal communication without being interested in interaction? What is interaction? What is interaction? Yes.
An exchange of ideas.
Exchange of ideas? So a romance is an exchange of ideas. Is that right?
Yes.
Oh, it is. Ah, I wonder about that. All of you agree with that? A romance is an exchange of ideas? It isn't. What is it? It's an exchange of feelings. That's a woman's point of view, isn't it? Men have no feelings. We left them when we were told at age 4 that big boys don't cry. Interaction. Interaction is what goes on. Can you be a sender and a receiver if you like those words? Can you be a sender and a receiver simultaneously? Simultaneously, you're talking to me. Even as I listen to you, if men ever listen, do I say something back? Yeah. You have to push your button.
Yeah, I got the button. It's all
Oh,
good.
boy.
Yeah, you do, because you give away body language and nonverbal communications when you speak
I
to
give
people.
them away.
Without even
Meaning
noticing.
I may be saying something that I don't even intend.
Yeah, like your eyebrow might twitch or something, you know, or your eyes might roll up to the corner if you're lying. Or...
You're bringing in something very important, and that is, to what extent can communication occur when it's not intentional? Because a lot of times we tend to think of communication as being highly intentional. Is that right? But sometimes we actually communicate and don't intend to do that. Yeah.
Yeah, I think I had mentioned to you before that it was everything and anything you want it to be, because I can pick up a signal from you that maybe, or if it's not a signal, but I can pick something up from you that maybe you're not trying to give me, like you said, an eyebrow twitch or something like that. But I can pick it up as, you know, you're not interested in what I'm saying or something to that effect.
To what extent are people good at interpreting nonverbal communication? To what extent do people think they're very good at interpreting nonverbal
Oh, well, people probably think they're very good at it, but...
We think we're very good at it, particularly in terms of deception detection, right? Is there something called counter-deception detection moves? When you think you're being caught, you then make other moves that mask those sorts of things, right? What did you say? I don't know. I didn't hear you. Yes. Well, I'm thinking of a good excuse for what it is, yes?
Not having a reaction in body language, just standing still is a reaction in itself.
Oh! You're right. I just thought I'd give you a little bit of that back. You're right. So that if I'm not paying attention to my wife when she's talking to me, I'm communicating, there is interaction, etc., and she's always attentive. She's always perfect. I say that because she knows I talk about us and the children and everything in these lectures, have for years. I suspect she buys a set and monitors it to see if I'm giving away any family secrets. So you'll see that I always make her the heroine of this story and myself the bad guy, because I'm not a fool. I may be a lot of things, but I'm not a fool. Well, all right, we're talking about some of the ingredients that go into this. Let's sort of go another direction with this and suggest that as we have worked over the years toward a definition of communication, we've centered on it as the notion of transmission from sender to receiver, but we know that that's very limited. We've tossed in some other words which we'll discuss later on, like feedback and message and channel. One of our guys, Gerbner, who's a big shot from the University of Pennsylvania School of Communication, he's a cultivation theory expert, talked about it as being interactions through messages. Messages are formally coded, he said. Formally coded. See, I don't think that's probably true. Symbolic or representational events, we'll talk more about representationalism in the chapter on language. We'll look to see how words come to have meaning or come not to have meaning. Of some shared significance in a culture produced for the purpose of evoking significance. Invoking significance means that somebody can make sense of it. Now, one of the words that Gerbner brought in that I think is very important, and that is culture. Do we communicate culture? And is culture communication? And does culture influence how we communicate? What do you think? Are we really willing to talk at that sort of level? Are we really willing to talk at that sort of level? Is there a U of H culture that might be different than a corporate America culture? All kinds of things. You have a much different kind of interaction day at the university than you would down at a job. If you were giving some sort of very formal music performance, you might act differently than if you were just having fun with friends, engaged in some kind of musical activity. So all of this begins then to suggest that culture, something as broad and large as culture, becomes meaningful. When we talk about organizational communication, we'll talk about culture. Because part of what makes an organization so we know what to do to coordinate our activities is based upon the culture of the organization. And when you go to work in an organization, how much effort do you expend to know what the culture of that organization is? Some people will put you through a new employee orientation. Is that enculturating you? And then do you ask everybody, do they really mean this? Are they serious? What's the policies? Because the policy as you do it can often be different than the policy that's written down. So culture is a way of working together. It's also tied up with regulative rules, isn't it? And substantive rules. You go into a company, you see how people act, what's the meaning that they are creating by what they do, when they do it, and how they do it. I worked for the Forest Service for 3 summers as I ended my undergraduate degree and worked into my master's degree, and every time we would finish a project, we would say, well, that's good enough for government work. To this day, I have no idea what is good enough for government work, but we were supposed to say that because whatever we had done is good enough for government work. It was the culture of us. It was who we were. It was what we did, how we did it, when we did it, why we did it, all of that kind of stuff. So as we argue that everything around us is communication, we can include even our culture. A process through which people create, maintain, and alter social order, relationships, and identities. Is that communication? We talk about this business of alienation. To what extent does communication create alienation within a society? Is it possible that the people at the top become alienated from the people at the bottom? Yes.
I think in some societies it has, especially when in that society you use language as a base of class.
A base of class and power and control and so on.
Yeah.
What about our society? Is there any alienation in our society?
I would think in some sense in comparison between like corporate world and say suburban where you use more Ebonics and regular language as a kind of a ceiling to when you hit corporate America and upper level politics and stuff like that when you have to use more fine language.
Okay. What about fairness? To what extent does the English language treat me fairly?
I don't think fairness really has anything to do with it, honestly.
We'll talk about that as time goes on. You had a sort of, did you have a shocked look on your, no? You were just thinking, yes.
Fairness compared to what?
Fairness compared to what you think fairness is. Does the English language treat you fairly?
I don't understand what you're trying to ask.
What's that?
I don't understand what you're trying to ask.
Do you think the English language treats you fairly as a woman? Does the English language contain terms that give you the same privileges as a woman that you might have if you were a man?
Yes and no.
Yes and no. We're into this yes and no business. She said no. He's going to raise his hand.
The question I got from what you asked was, you know, if the English language treats us fairly.
He's using feedback to give me an idea whether my message got through.
Yeah, I thought maybe you were talking about, you know, someone's understanding and entire vocabulary as he used for being seen as maybe a better person. Like if I have a better language,
person, right? What are better persons? More privileged people, more freedom, and so forth.
In this case, I think I would consider it as having a better vocabulary, a more expanded vocabulary, as being able to be treated better.
When you say an expanded vocabulary, is that the words that we know or the words that we associate with ourselves and our identity treating us fairly or unfairly?
No, probably the words that we use in speech and
are
communication.
Activities like the civil rights movement designed to change the meaning of language? Yes.
When you're asking the question about fairness, are you referring to the way that it's male-dominated in the language, it's like postmen and using stuff like that and salesmen?
Even beyond that, I suspect, right?
Yeah.
Men make more money than women? Yes, they do. Why? Because they're men. That's the point, right? So language may not treat you fairly by age, by race, by ethnicity, all of those things. Do those impose restrictions or allow freedoms that are not necessarily equal and or free within a society? Yes?
Are you trying to suggest that language is tainted and communication is tainted? Okay.
Oh, I'm trying to suggest it. I'm going to shout it from the top of my voice when we get into a theory by Kenneth Burke that argues that we have what's called linguistic relativity, that words impose meaning on the world around us and that we act toward the world based upon what meaning we think is imposed. For instance, a little boy comes into the world, a little girl comes into the world, they're born in the world, we announce one's a boy, one's a girl. Do they have different futures for themselves? May very well. Does it differ by culture? If that same boy and girl were to be born in Saudi Arabia, would the woman have more or fewer rights than the boy? Well, part of it depends upon how rich you are, but beyond that, right? Your religion may give you a way of acting and being which defines who you are, and that can be male-dominated, as he suggested. So you see, we're really talking about a lot of stuff when we talk about communication. Okay, let's see what else we found here. It deals with social order, relationships, and identities. To what extent does how we are communicated with define our identity? To what extent does how we are communicated with define our identity? I mentioned before, I grew up with people telling me that big boys don't cry. That's a rule. That's a regulative rule, isn't it? Yeah.
Whenever my sister, whenever she was growing up, we always talked to her as if she was an adult, and now that she's grown up more, she seems to have a better understanding and larger vocabulary.
This is his sister? Yes. I grew up with an older sister. So I'm just teasing. I was going to say, so I'm worried about sisters. They're always trying to beat up on you. No, I'm just teasing. Part of it is our own experience, isn't it? What our own identity with other individuals are. Within your family, do you have different identities or different variations of your identity with different people? Do you say things different if grandmother is around than when grandmother's not around? Or one grandmother as opposed to the other, and all of these kinds of things? So part of the notion of communication, is it impression management? Is communication doing something along the line of what we call impression management? Is dating impression management? Well, we got to see that again tonight. Cupid's on again tonight. Sooner or later we'll get Cupid on the WebCT, I hope, and we can talk about it. But all of these people are trying to manage their impressions so that she loves them. They get to be married for a year, and they split $1 million. Now that's part of the deal, isn't it? Yeah.
You said to what extent do how we're spoken to define our identity?
Yes.
And I was wondering, does how we're spoken to define our identity, or our identity defines how we're spoken to?
Well, it can be both. Because if you come on belligerent, there is a term typical today called he or she's got an attitude. We know that everybody's got lots of attitudes, but if you come on with an attitude, which is your identity, do people communicate differently towards you? Yeah, whatever that means, an attitude. But we know that it's not a good thing to have necessarily, right? Yeah. Oh, and part of that is impression management. I don't know how many of you ever done anything like be a receptionist or all this kind of stuff. Good morning, how are you? My wife worked with a woman whose husband worked for a company that I thought was going to go bankrupt because the receptionist would say, it sounded like she was asleep. And I kept saying, why don't you get that woman a little coffee or something like that? Because the organization needed to manage its impression, didn't it?
I think a good project to take on would be the University of Houston, whatever recording thing that, you know, when you called the number
the VIPs?
to talk, well, or to talk to somebody in financial aid or something.
Yeah.
There's this annoying voice that's obviously a student. They wanted like a student's voice as opposed to an adult. And they come on and they say, please hold for the next available person to assist you, and that it'll be soon. That will assist you shortly.
Right.
And of course it's never shortly. It goes, you know,
on
it takes
and on
forever.
and on and on.
And
have you ever tried to call the telephone company? My wife tried to call MCI yesterday. There are layers upon layers upon layers. I think she's next, and then you. Okay.
Let me tell you the key. Don't push any buttons and pretend you have a rotary phone, and you'll get to an operator quick.
Okay.
That's the least of the problems in the financial aid office.
All right. We do surveys every once in a while on this campus, and parking and the financial aid office always come up with the greatest problem for students, right? Okay, well, what I'm trying to do is to open you to all of the stuff that we have to take into consideration when we talk about communication. Communication, as we sort of suggested on day one, may be the process of social influence, which is sort of what I think somebody was suggesting earlier today, the process of social influence, the ways in which we become meaningful to each other. And by being meaningful, we coordinate our activities with one another so that we can share this space in one way or another, harmoniously, disharmoniously, whatever it might be. One of the other themes that gets into this is that communication is a process. It is a process to the extent that it is ongoing, it is never-ending, it is ever-changing. What's interesting to me is that people line up to study in English classes material that is presented to them in what is now a foreign language. Shakespeare is a foreign language. Beowulf is a foreign language. But there was a time when people routinely spoke that way. Can you imagine Shakespeare actually being sort of a soap opera writer? Oh, they wrote for a popular audience. I hope to think that we will produce a Shakespeare on Days of My Life, or All of My Children, or my General Hospital, or my Less General Hospital, or any of these sorts of things. But I doubt it. Somehow, I really don't think that we are doing what Shakespeare might have done. What is different about languages in those eras in the English vocabulary is simply time. We change. We were talking earlier about cool. I'm cool. I'm peachy keen. I'm all of these kinds of things. Words change over times. Why? Because we invent words. We kill words. Words die. Words change. It's dynamic, doesn't it? So does interaction rituals. We go and look and see how people acted with one another years ago and by different cultures and so forth, and we begin to realize that all of what we're talking about is how people in one way or another communicate. We jump onto this train called communication. We learn that it is a system. We learn that it is a set of rules. We learn that those rules are regulative and substantive. We play the game for a while in varying degrees of ability, and then when we no longer are a part of that game, it still goes on. It still goes on. It still goes on. It's a process. Well, where did communication come from? Where did communication studies come from? There are four major sources of communication study that are influential on us today. If I were to ask you when we began to study communication, some of you might say, well, maybe 100 years ago, or some of you might even say 2,500 years ago, but the truth is, my guess is, that humans began to study communication once they had developed some sense of identity, some sense that people in the unit did something different with more influence than other people. How do we work together, cooperate together? I think one of the great qualities of the human species is our ability to work together cooperatively. We're not as good as ants. We also can engage in cataclysmic wars, but it is the defining element that allowed us to survive, because at the survival game, we're pretty bad. We can't climb trees quickly. We can't slither and wiggle like snakes. We can't capture our game very well. All kinds of things out there were bigger and tougher and meaner and faster than we are, but we worked together and we made it. And we did it through communication. So probably at the point of human awareness, they began to study communication. Flip on into any of the great civilizations, whatever it might be. Civilizations in Turkey, civilizations in Babylon, civilizations in China. When the societies became increasingly sophisticated, they engaged in the formal understanding of the nature of communication. For us in Western society, which is predominantly where the influence has come to be on communication theory, although there is now an influence coming out of Tao and other kinds of Asian religions, but it's not having a lot of influence, a little bit of influence. The study of communication as we know it today probably corresponded to the age of the golden age of the Greeks. Names like Plato and Aristotle and Isocrates, and later Romans like Quintilian and Cicero, people began to study rhetoric. They realized that within a society, certain individuals were more or less influential. The Greeks had lost land to the tyrants. The tyrants were thrown out. They had to go and argue to get their land back. A group of people called the Sophists grew up to teach people to speak so they could get their land back. They studied speech making 2,500 years ago. There are huge bodies of writing about the nature of discourse. And even at that time, they were well aware that discourse had ethical considerations. Call it character, call it goodwill, call it whatever you might. People were quite aware of the fact that character was a part of the communication process. They talked about facts, they talked about reasoning, they talked about delivery, they talked about language, they talked about all kinds of things. That pretty well persists. It was alive and well and robust coming into the 20th century, and it exists today. That body of literature is still very much relevant. So one of the first whole bodies of literature about the nature of communication originated in ancient Greece and came up to us through Western society. A second influence in our discussion and understanding of communication came out of propaganda studies. Propaganda studies. Propaganda is actually quite an old word. It grew out of the Catholic Church. It was a word used to propagate the faith, to go forward and convert people through strategic communication. In the 20th century, propaganda became something even more important in society, and people studied propaganda. There was an institute for propaganda. If you read Mein Kampf, which was written by Hitler, as you remember, Hitler will say that everything he learned about propaganda he learned from the British and the Americans during the First World War. And many people say that Hitler was excellent at propaganda. Now, one of the problems with propaganda is that it also is value-laden, isn't it? We tell the truth, and those that speak against us are engaging in propaganda. Typically, the notion is that propaganda is the mass dissemination of messages that we don't approve of, that we don't like, or that we think creates a society that we may not want. But we engage in propaganda, but we don't think of it that way because we're telling the truth and other people are propagandizing. Now, one of the reasons that we are also interested in propaganda is that it gave us an opportunity to begin to think about the concept of media and media effects. One of the great differences in communication in the mid to late 19th century on through the 20th century has been mass media, the mass channels of communication that will allow people to communicate with one another or will keep them from being able to communicate with one another. Some of you may remember, for instance, the report by the Minister of Information, as I recall, for Saddam Hussein's regime as the American and British troops were coming closer and closer and they'd taken Baghdad, and the guy was reporting that none of the troops were there, etc., etc. Was he telling the truth? Well, I guess if Saddam was sitting behind me with a .45, I would have said, whatever you want to say is what I will say today. And I don't know that Saddam was. Maybe the guy was just doing whatever he did, who knows. But the notion is that the ability to communicate with a lot of people over a distance in time and space, mass communication, changed things, but it was propaganda that caused us to be so concerned about that. We also got one of our very linear communication models, a heavy media effects interpretation of communication from the propaganda researchers. Okay. Now, so we've got two: rhetoric, propaganda studies. A third is group dynamics. Group dynamics. Group dynamics, the study of groups and group problem solving in meetings, is a vital part of our life. A family is a group. We have meetings. We don't necessarily call them that, although I do know families who hold meetings. The Bradys hold meetings, right? Yes. Interesting again, here comes old Hitler. After the First World War, the German government was limited as to how many officers it could have at a given time. So Hitler was fascinated at how people became leaders. And he commissioned a bunch of social scientists, and the social scientists studied group interaction because they know that leadership is exerted through group behavior. Who leads a group? Now, it's interesting that many of the people that were in that research project just happened to be Jews. And they also got pretty clever at figuring out that they could foretell a future that was not terribly friendly to them. And a number of these people, in various ways, with their families, migrated to the United States, bringing with them all of this discussion. But the United States was already interested in group discussion because the nature of our First Amendment suggests that we get together and we discuss things. We solve things. We're interested in leadership, etc., etc. That laid a foundation for our studies later on called organizational communication. So the third influence on the history of communication studies was an interest in group dynamics. An interest in group dynamics. The fourth great influence, and you can go home and ask your parents, or maybe now your grandparents, what was it like to be around and a college student in the 60s? The 60s. Interpersonal communication became big because we were all going to love one another. We had love-ins, we had love-outs, we had love this and love that. We were just going to love, 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 love. We became fascinated. Now, we weren't alone in starting that, meaning that we weren't alone not having any antecedents. Other people had studied this kind of thing. But there is no doubt that the interest in relationship development, the interest in love, the interest in how people work together cooperatively, and does communication make us feel better or worse? The whole theme of identity and alienation, those were really, really powerful concepts back in the 60s. Because we knew that language could force us apart. This society was being torn apart. Family members ceased to talk to one another. We were fighting within our own families over issues of war and race and economy. It was a very, very unhappy time in some respects, and then on the other hand, it was a very happy time. Music often characterizes those two polar opposites. Music can often be very positive and happy, or music can be very sad and despondent about the conditions of society. And there's no doubt that rock music and other forms of music have dealt with the nature of relationships. And a lot of that really was, I can't say that it was just commercialized, because it wasn't, but it was very much on the top of people's minds. What's the nature of relationships? How can we live together? How can we work together? How can we stop war? How can we stop poverty? How can we stop racism? How can we stop injustices? How can we do all of these sorts of things? And communication, we realized, was both a positive and a negative force. Positive and negative force. And so the 60s in various ways added a lot to what was going on. Well, in the evolution of time, kind of interesting that 1960 was one of those hallmark days. There was a very important communication scientist by the name of Bernard Berelson, who got up in an academic meeting one time, and I think the year was 1959, and his argument was that we knew everything there was to know about communication, that we needed never to do any more to study communication ever again. And ironically enough, your lives as a communication student would have been better off if he had been right, because then it would have been a work in stop at that point rather than a work in progress. But it's a work in progress. Where are we going? What are we going to study next? How are we going to study it? What additional insights? The next year, two very important books were published. One of those books was published by a fellow by the name of Berlo, B-E-R-L-O. And I say that only, you're never going to have to match Berlo with anything. I don't believe in matching and all of that kind of stuff. But Berlo, and you could find it in the text, was a pretty heavy hitter. Berlo was the guy that really popularized the SMCR feedback model. Other people had talked about it, but he elevated it and made it more popular. He built an entire communication theory book around it, and it may have been the first communication theory book as a theory book ever written, 1960. Sender or source, he had very much a sender-receiver model. He was arguing that the old transmission model was not right. Message is what we communicate. Channel is the technology through which we communicate, or the senses that we use to communicate. And then there was a receiver. Then there's something called feedback. And we're going to discuss that as we get closer to those topics at the end of the chapter. Plow back through some of that. The next thing in that regard was a guy by the name of Clapper. The media effects had long been concerned that it had a dominant influence over people, that if you got control of the media, you could control people. And Clapper, a guy by the name of Joseph Clapper, wrote a book in which he argued for a minimal effects model, saying that the media play a small role in the influence in the formation of messages. I mean, of opinions and beliefs and motives. He suggested that interpersonal communication played a very, very real role. He argued that we typically tend to expose ourselves selectively to messages that we like and ignore that which we don't like, so that we're not just sitting there every day having the media tell us what to think. We seek the media out. We expose ourselves to some things, we ignore other things. We remember some things, we don't remember other things. It was this selectivity model that very much characterized the nature of media effects in the mind of Clapper. Well, along the way here, and I'm going to flip down, we had some of the pioneers in the development of models. One of these is a guy by the name of Shannon, who worked for the telephone company, and he was an engineer, and a fellow by the name of Weaver, who was a social scientist. And Shannon and Weaver came up with the notion of information transmission and reception. And you'll notice when you see this transparency that the word efficiency is put in there. They wanted to understand how to communicate efficiently. They worked for the telephone company. They wanted to be able to reduce the noise in the line. They wanted to be able to increase the willingness of individuals to use a telephone. And so one of the ways in which they could do that was to make the telephone communication more efficient. Another fellow by the name of Schramm introduced interaction and argued that communication had limited effects. And a third pair was Wesley and McLean, who talked about news influence and the processes associated with that. So let's take a quick look. I don't know whether these come up on your screen or not. I've got them up on my screen. Where they come up, I don't know. Anyway, in the book, and I pointed this out to you earlier on, the Shannon and Weaver model, I'll find momentarily, is on page 64. It begins with an information source. Oh, it's up there now? Okay. One of the things that I thought you might do when you talked about communication earlier is to say that communication has something to do with information. Because people like to believe that it has something to do with information, and particularly if they're interested in journalism. Journalists like to believe that they are the great informers of the world. Journalists also at times don't like the notion of persuasion. Is a news story informative or persuasive?
Both.
Both. Tell me, how does that work?
It can inform you on the facts of the subject, but they can also put in facts and leave out facts that may persuade you to think one way or another about something.
It could do that, but it also could persuade me to believe that those indeed were the facts. Have we ever read a news story that's not true or not accurate, but we were told that it was? Could be, yeah.
I think that being a person writing it, you're going to have your own personal tone to it, and that would be the difference. Even though you're supposed to report on facts, you still have persuasion in, because you're going to write from a certain perspective, whether it be conservative, democratic, liberal, you know, and therefore you have the persuasion in the background, even though it's facts that you're writing down.
Okay.
But most journalists aren't going to admit to, you know, trying to be persuasive, because they think that inherently you have to be objective to be a journalist, unless you're writing for, you know, some magazine, or you're doing opinion pieces. Or
and then there are people like Norman Mailer, who says there is no such thing as objectivity, that everything is subjective. And we read opinions, whether it's announced to be an opinion or not, right? Anyway, an information source, you'll notice the transmitter in this model. The transmitter is like a channel, and for them, the transmitter was the device that creates the vibrating sound. Do I tell you something about telephones that you have forgotten? As you speak into a receiver, do you create a vibrating set of signals, if you would, that then go either through a wire or now over a wireless medium to the other individual who has a device that captures those vibrations? One phone talking to another phone. That's probably the purest form of transmission and reception, to think of it just in terms of electronic signal, isn't it? And then the two people on the phone, if it's a grandmother talking to a grandchild, or two people romantically liking one another, or two people romantically not liking each other, what goes on is really quite different, isn't it? But the medium itself is relatively neutral, and that's one of the arguments that we'll make about a system, is that the stuff in a system is often relatively neutral, but it is how people respond to it that brings in the meaning. Then we have the receiver, and here the receiver is not a person. The receiver is the receiving device, and then the destination is the person over here. And somebody used the words decoding. We often use encoding to create a message, meaning that I've got an idea, I select words, I use those words and other symbols to get my message put together, send it out. People get it, they decode it. We like all of that kind of terminology, don't we? The destination is a decoder. What do these sounds mean? Sometimes on your cell phone or your friend's cell phone, you can't make them out. They are breaking up. Well, that was the sort of thing that Shannon particularly was interested in Weaver to a certain extent. Noise source. Noise to them was physical racket. We'll talk later on that noise may be attitudinal. Is there such a thing as attitudinal noise? Is there such a thing as cultural noise? Is there such a thing as demographic experience noise? All the factors that can make us not be able to understand one another arguably can be noise. We'll even talk about noise as having something to do with the business of information. Our Schramm model. Schramm uses these words encoder and decoder, but you'll notice that he's got them for both the person on one side and the other side of the conversation simultaneously. As far as I know, Schramm was the first person that tried to create a communication model that would capture communication in all of its contexts: personal, interpersonal, organizational, and mass-mediated. And he wanted to suggest that people were constantly sending messages back and forth. And he even made the argument that interaction exists in mass media if for no other reason than we have readership surveys, we have listener surveys, we have advertiser satisfaction or dissatisfaction, meaning that if people watch the program and buy the product, that's a feedback, if you would. That's a message sent back that we like this, we buy the products, etc., etc. It is one of the ways to look at the nature of interaction. One of the ways to look at the nature of interaction. You'll also notice another term that he puts into this, and that is to treat people as interpreters. Do you like that notion or not? As communicators, we're an interpreter. We're trying to figure out what's going on. We try to create interpretations. We try to manage interpretations. We may try to limit interpretations. A while ago, our friend back there talked about the effective communication. Both Shannon Weaver and Schramm wanted to know how that would occur. And one of the ways that it may occur is that we try to limit the kinds of interpretations that people can put on what it is that we say, which is a way of eliminating ambiguity, isn't it? It's trying to reduce the amount of misunderstanding. It may increase the likelihood that people will interpret us as a credible advisor on what products to buy. That could be called advertising. But accuracy, efficiency, effectiveness, these were key elements in the discussion of individuals like this. But Schramm also believed that communication could have a lot to do with making us a better or a worse society. As we communicated, Schramm argued, at all levels, we had to take into consideration that we're not just information sharers, but we influence what people think. We work together. We ultimately ought to try to achieve some larger level of understanding. But he also knew that people communicated at the individual level as well as the societal level to create misunderstanding. 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 People systematically setting out to create misunderstanding. Well, and you remember when I talked about models last time, I suggested that there were 3 types of models. Well, it wasn't last time, it was the first day, as I recall. 3 kinds of models. One is a taxonomy, a list of terms. Secondly is a pictorial model. All of these are pictorial models. Thirdly was a mathematical model. What is a model? It is a way in which we show people who are trying to understand what we're talking about, what it is that we are talking about. On the assumption that by showing the relationship between the variables and the key variables, we can better explain the phenomena under discussion. Now, one of the things that you notice is that models tended to get more and more and more complicated. Shannon Weaver model, relatively simple, but probably left out a lot of stuff. The Schramm model, more complicated. Now we've got Wesley McLean. These are actually 4 models. What they're trying to do here is to show the relationship between individuals and reality. You are B. Reality is X. The assumption is that you want to know what reality is. And one of the ways in which you engage in understanding reality is to experience reality. You want to know what hot means. You touch something, and if it burns your finger, it's hot. You want to know what cold is. If you touch your finger and it's cool, it's cold, etc., etc. A, then, A is a newspaper, because newspapers bring us a view of reality. But his argument was, or their argument was, that we check the newspaper's sense of reality against the reality that we know, so that we may know something that differs from what the newspapers report as the truth. Now we've got C in there. And then we've got A through C to B, and B is going back and checking reality. And oh my gosh, we get so many X's, and we get so many lines, and we get so many circles. And as Jennings and I talk about in this chapter, imagine trying to capture in a model all of what goes on at a party of teenagers, supervised by two people, one of whom the children like and one of whom the children despise. How do we begin to model that? Well, the problem that we came to in the study of communication is that we learned that there is a limit to what you can do by modeling. Models will capture certain elements of the communication process, but to try to capture all the communication process in a single model is probably way too difficult. But models can be useful nevertheless. The second thing is that as people put these models out, people begin then to think about what are the key concepts, what's the relationship between these key concepts. And what I want to do, if I can get this thing to act right, which I may or may not be able to do. Oops, I don't want to end the show yet. Uh-oh. Let's see. Aha. I did just what I thought I wasn't going to do. Is that next time, what I want to do, and it's at the end of the chapter, the person that put my slides together put this way too early, thinking that I would start the chapter with this instead of build up to it, which is what we do in the chapter. What I want to do is to talk about what is sender, what is receiver, what is intent and purpose. Some of these terms we talked about today, didn't we? Can we communicate without intent? Can we communicate without purpose? What's feedback? What's message? What's channel? What's interaction? What's context? What are the cognitive processes that go on? For instance, in the chapter on mass media, we'll talk about episodic memory. Episodic memory? What do you mean by episodic memory? To what extent, if you start watching a television program that you've not watched from the beginning, do you really know what's going on? My daughter and son-in-law heard about The Sopranos, but they've been in Norway and Spain. They came back, and they will not let me talk about Tony and what's going on. They want to go back and get this from the very beginning, because they want the episodic memory that they develop as they move along, and they won't want me to tell what happened at the end of last year when she threw him out. You don't watch The Sopranos? How could you not watch The Sopranos? I'm just teasing. You're poor college students. Get a friend. Get a friend, right? Well, we're nearly out of time. You think, boy, that's the high point of today. I'll be happy to go back over any of these topics to get us back into where we want to be, but what I want to do on Thursday is to work our way through this to find out what we think these terms mean, and also sometimes to find out that we don't have a very good idea as individuals what many of these terms really mean. So we'll see you then.